I think people are going to want to watch for this scene very carefully. It might even arouse some controversy. I'm curious to see what sort of general reaction we get on that. Well, for example, feminists out there, they might be wanting to jump on a scene like that, saying you play a very vulnerable female character capable of a lot of feelings, but yet the male has to instruct you, that sort of thing. Is that something that never has bothered you about doing that scene?
The scene is not a scene I'd want to do over again.
No?
It's not a scene I'd want to do over again because of the violent intention of the character Deckard. I mean, it wasn't a pleasant scene.
In recent years, I have seen some criticism towards Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and in particular, its love scene, if we can even call it that. People object to what they perceive to be a display of romanticized predatory behavior, with some outright arguing that protagonist Deckard sexually assaults love interest Rachael. For some, the inclusion of this scene taints the overall quality of the film. Others will say it is completely unnecessary, which frankly, I don't really agree with. The general criticism does hold some merit, but discussion surrounding it tends to be misguided. The scene is thematically rich, and is more significant to the narrative than people lead on. It is a tricky topic though, and one that should be approached with more sensitivity than skepticism, so I will try to be nuanced and fair. While I'm not really a fan of summary, it's important that we recognize what happens before we interpret it, and apply moral judgment. The scene in contention plays out as follows. A drunken Deckard kisses a distraught Rachael on the cheek and neck multiple times. He goes in for a kiss on the lips, but Rachael backs away in hesitation, much to his expressed disappointment. She gets up and tries leaving the room. He reaches out but fails to grab her. As she runs to the door, he quickly catches up to her, aggressively closing the door as fast as she opens it. Deckard begins cornering Rachael as she steps backward. He briefly grabs her as something akin to anger is written on his face. Deckard then pushes Rachael against the window and comes close to her once again. As he reaches out to her and she backs away, his hand motion signals he will approach her gently. The music calms, likely to reinforce the idea that Deckard is neither a threat to Rachael, nor is perceived as such. Deckard places his hands behind her, asserting his physical presence, while not actually touching her. She begins to cry. She does not appear afraid of him, and instead looks at him straight in the eye, and then downward as if embarrassed, presumably feeling ashamed of wanting to accept him. The jazzy score by Vangelis sets the mood, suggesting the moment is to be seen as emotionally charged and romantic. This is confirmed as he leans in for a kiss, which she accepts. More specifically, she subtly lifts up her chin to make it easier for him to kiss her, showing herself receptive to his actions. But as she continues to cry, Deckard tells her it is her turn to kiss him.
You kiss me.
She says something in turn, but does not complete her sentence.
I can't rely on... Say, kiss me.
She cannot rely on something. We will come back to this. Deckard tells her to tell him to kiss her. She does just this. They kiss some more. Deckard says, I want you. She says the same thing to him.
I want you. I want you.
He might still be instructing her what to say, or they may just be expressing mutual affection for each other. Either way, he tells her to repeat herself, which she does. And it is at this point that she speaks for herself by requesting him to put his hands on her.
Put your hands on me.
They embrace each other and share a passionate kiss. So there is a lot to unpack here, but the pressing question remains, does Rachael consent? Well, to answer that, we should recognize where Rachael is coming from in this situation. Her entire life up until this point has been a lie. She is not human in the traditional recognition of humans. Instead, she is a replicant, a bioengineered being with programmed emotions and implanted memories belonging to someone else. And like all replicants, Rachael is subject to retirement, which I guess is the nice way of saying execution. Upon learning the truth, Rachael's entire world spirals downward into oblivion. Her understanding of humanity has been violently stripped away from her, and she loses her sense of self. With this knowledge, every action she does has potential to be a first, and knowing this makes processing emotions and creating her own memories all the more painful.
She knows how to handle this corporation that she works in, but when she gets in a situation, which she eventually does, where she has to relate to somebody physically, sexually, emotionally, she is as close to a virgin as anyone could be, because she's never had the experiences, regardless of how much of a woman she may look like. So she is in this situation with Deckard where he tries to kiss her and she runs away, and Deckard stops her and is not exactly violent with her, but he realizes somewhere that this must come to pass, that they love one another, and she learns what emotions are because of the pain of the situation and the pain of having to feel something for the first time.
Just moments before the controversial sequence, Rachael is seen playing the piano. She states that she wasn't sure if she could play or not, as the memories she had of lessons may belong to someone else.
I didn't know if I could play. I remember lessons. I don't know if it's me or Terrell's niece.
Even as she plays, she calls into question who this talent belongs to, basically discrediting any and every recognized human attribute. As Deckard compliments her abilities, he is likely attempting to reinforce the legitimacy of her personhood.
You play beautifully.
Every kiss on her cheek is a validation of her humanity. Her emotions are real and should be treated as such. She wants to be with him, at least from what the film suggests, both directly and indirectly, depending on the cut. Being one with another person on a sexually intimate level is a primal human instinct, something that is seen as a defining trait of her essence. Well, for many people anyway, definitely not everyone, but it's a generalized truth. Rachael likely desires to consummate this new relationship, but doing so would be embracing her human interest, something she starts to distrust the legitimacy of. When she is hesitant to kiss him and stay with him, it's not so much that she denies him, but rather she denies herself. She denies her humanity, and thus denies that she has the right to accept his advances. By walking out that door, Rachael would be throwing away her life, emotionally, physically, and philosophically, abused by the system that created her, lied to her, and abandoned her, as if she were nothing but a toy.
Rachael is an experiment, nothing more.
Leaving would practically be suicide, especially considering she now has a target on her back.
There's 3 to go.
There's 4.
That skin job you vacated at Tyrell Corporation? Rachael disappeared, vanished. Didn't even know she was a replicant.
But Deckard refuses to let her go, refuses to let her deny her validity as a person. Because to him, she is human, and her experiences are valid. But he gets his point across by asserting his physical dominance. When Rachael begins to say, "I can't rely on," it can be assumed that she is verbally expressing consent, but she argues she cannot rely on her human emotions, ones she now recognizes as artificial implants. As a Blade Runner, it is Deckard's job to read the emotional responses of replicants and determine how they differ from traditional humans. Deckard is more than conscious of Rachael's internal conflict and does what he can to validate her emotions. Arguably, Deckard's ability to read her emotional state is why he is justified in preventing her from leaving, as well as sexualizing the situation. Though that doesn't necessarily justify the extent of force he uses to achieve this. An ethical paradox can indeed be extrapolated from the scene. Rachael incongruously makes the autonomous decision to reject her autonomy by throwing her life away to the hunters. And we must recognize this as an autonomous decision if we do in fact view Deckard as violating her autonomy. But then, such violation of said autonomy would in turn be reinforcing the legitimacy of said autonomy. Deckard's actions can easily be seen as predatory and wrong, not because she doesn't want to be with him, I believe she does, but because he violates her already self-violating autonomy.
Say, kiss me.
Kiss me.
We recognize Rachael's autonomy because we recognize Rachael as human, and therefore, her human autonomy is violated. But if Rachael were to leave, she would be willingly rejecting her own humanity that we ascribe to her, something we ascribe largely because she aims to reject it. I would almost say it is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, if it weren't for the fact that I read her as submitting to Deckard willingly. And eventually, she surrenders to her recognition of self-governance by instructing Deckard what to do, independently, and according to her human interest.
Put your hands on me.
Now, I've been saying human and humanity, but it really is a bit more complicated than that. The replicant experience is human, in the sense of emotional legitimacy, but the actual experiences transcend the realm of what is recognized as human. The replicants are more human than humans.
More human than human is our motto.
They are something else entirely, and thus their experiences have a different modus operandi. It's also important to recognize Deckard isn't exactly the hero of the story. This should be clear through his final interactions with Roy Batty during the film's climax, in which he has something of an epiphany over the human replicant experience. That is, after having spent most of the film hunting down replicants with a sense of moral ambivalence. Predator and prey dynamics are present between Deckard and the replicants, and this includes Rachael. Whether his sexual advances are technically predatory or not, the subtext is there. He is still pursuing his prey. But this time, perhaps he is taming his prey instead of killing it. It is predatory coding. For this reason, it can be argued that his actions are more so a depiction of forced acquiescence rather than organic consent. But based on the fact she not only appears untraumatized, but also infatuated following his advances, she likely did want it.
Do you love me?
I love you.
Do you trust me?
I trust you.
But acknowledging the fact he is depicted as a predator in a non-sexual context to the other replicants throughout the film, the reading of forced acquiescence can still be affirmed. So then, how can these two possibilities be synthesized? While Deckard may not be a rapist, his behavior towards Rachael is like a client's behavior towards a prostitute. For Rachael, this is affirming, in that she is treated like a woman, instead of less than feminine, damaged goods. But it is also predatory, insofar as her female sexuality is prioritized over the grander scope of her personhood. The angry pressure Deckard directs towards her for self-loathing and denying her feelings may indeed help her in that moment, but the effectiveness of this method may only be temporary. When it becomes habitual, angry sex can become a drug-like escape from conflict, an asset of humanity, and so it eats away, rather than truly affirms, someone's humanity over time, which might be particularly dangerous to someone with a fragile mentality like Rachael, regardless if she consents in the moment. However, it is often within flawed human interest to act according to one's emotions in the given moment, to act on what is perceived as best in said moment, without particular care for the larger ramifications these actions can have within relationships in the long run. A sense of raw catharsis and liberation may be felt because characters surrender to their emotions and create a moment to remember, but also a moment that will be lost in time.
All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die.
In any case, Deckard's actions are morally questionable at best, especially considering just how aggressive he gets with her. Rachael seems to find arousal through masochistic foreplay, but there wasn't enough evidence to suggest Deckard would know her kinks in advance, right? Well, the Voight-Kampff test did last for some time, and it did feature some sexually suggestive questions right off the bat.
You're reading a magazine, you come across a full-page nude photo of a girl.
Is this testing whether I'm a replicant or a lesbian, Mr. Deckard?
Just answer the questions, please.
I can't be too sure what he learned about her sexually in advance, but that's okay.
He showed you his, and when it got to be your turn, you chickened and ran. Remember that?
The film is meant to be morally ambiguous and open to interpretation. That is largely why the narration present in the original theatrical cut was dropped in later releases. This scene is really no different, but it takes the morally ambiguous to another level, sparking some fair criticism in turn.
I was struck by that in the script. I wasn't quite sure maybe what was going on there.
You think you weren't
as
clear
an
what was going on? Think how I felt.
On the topic of ambiguity, Deckard's status as a traditional human is meant to be questioned. As the text hints, he may very well be a replicant himself.
You know that Voight comp test of yours? Did you ever take that test yourself?
Thus, his attempt at affirming Rachael's autonomy is also an attempt at affirming his own. Likewise, his understanding of her plight could be him wrestling with his own. After all, Deckard is morally reluctant to take the job he is forced into. People are ostensibly brainwashed to passively accept the oppressive neo-capitalist system in place, which in turn calls into question the legitimacy of our own understanding of consent. But that's a whole other discussion. At any rate, even if Deckard and Rachael do not fully consent to their fabricated memories, programmed emotions, and other material conditions of their body and soul, they ought to accept their social status and legitimize their emotions in order to carry on and navigate the best that they can in life, no matter how long they have left.
It's too bad she won't live. But then again, who does?
However, just because Rachael wants to be with Deckard does not necessarily mean he has the ethical right to act sexually aggressive to her and assert he knows what is best, even if he's meant to be correct in the text. Whether subversive or not, and whether properly justified in context or not, this is implementing something on the lines of a potentially harmful narrative trope. That being, women secretly want it, even when they say no. That through persistence, no matter how toxic, they will come to realize their repressed desires for their aggressor. No matter how many times the woman says otherwise, the man is right, and the woman will eventually realize this. This idea does not generally reflect women's desires, and therefore trivializes the right to say no. Like many things, this trope still has a place within select context, but it shouldn't necessarily take a dominant position within popular media. Yet, this has been a recurring trope throughout history. Some have pointed out that this trope is even present in other Harrison Ford films.
The scene only lasts about a minute and a half, during which time she rebuffs his advances 8 different times with both verbal and nonverbal communication, and he ignores and disregards her each time. Some will of course object to this reading of the scene.
In The Empire Strikes Back, one may find thematic justifications for Han Solo recognizing Princess Leia's repressed desires. He is unconsciously in touch with the Force, and thus has the intuition necessary to recognize her repressed feelings.
No, that's not it. Come on. Come on.
You're imagining things.
Likewise, the war has conditioned her to reject love, or anything beyond the war for that matter. She did nearly lose her brother, so rejecting other attachments, especially those she loves, can be rationalized given her context. It takes something out of the ordinary, a scoundrel like Han Solo, to make her confront her basic human feelings and alleviate the pain she experiences.
You like me because I'm a scoundrel. There aren't enough scoundrels in your life.
I happen to like nice men.
Nice man.
Very nice.
But, even with contextual justification, the contentious idea may still be propagated.
Stop that.
Stop what?
Stop that. Let go.
Shh.
Let go, please.
Don't get excited.
Captain, being held by you isn't quite enough to get me excited.
Sorry, sweetheart. I haven't got time for anything else.
There are many ways to analyze text. One can attempt to assess a text in relative isolation, or assess it in the broader context of media and society at large. A given writing decision may be what's best for the individual text, but could suffer in its grander place in media, and the reverse can definitely be true too.
I mean, it wasn't a pleasant scene. It wasn't the type of scene where you go, darling. You know, I mean, that wouldn't have been appropriate in terms of that scene anyhow. So you just, it's meant to arouse that type of feeling in you. It's not exactly a real love scene.
With culturally significant and mainstream text, audience perception is a key factor to consider. I have said before that if it can be justified textually, just about any reading is valid. I try to be consistent with this, but some readings do irritate me. I suppose that is because they are often flawed, as textual evidence contradicts the critic's method of interpretation, which would mean that it is not necessarily even justified by the text. A good example is how people read Rachael in the seduction scene, with some assuming she is crying because Deckard isn't letting her leave. To me, it's pretty clear that her tears are brought about by her fragile emotional state, following her loss of identity and the inability to carry on with the knowledge of holding false memories and the pain of creating new ones. She was on the verge of crying as she got up to leave, and she may even be excited by his aggressive advances. Now, don't misunderstand me. There are plenty of reasons to object to details within the scene, or at the very least, object to the character's actions. But detractors have a tendency to not read it closely. I generally try to give a film's narrative the benefit of the doubt, provided by its textual details. There's no need to be a black and white moralist, or a one-note censorious prude. I feel that good art, especially art in the mainstream, should broaden minds and provide insight on the human condition, encouraging us to consider things that we hadn't previously thought critically about. If you don't read a text closely, you may not be getting much out of it, which unfortunately is the case for many. Films that are made for adults, and not children, should welcome ambiguity with open arms. Adults ought to be able to think critically for themselves, and decide what a text is saying, or should be saying, without falling back on broad, absolutist claims that are based on generalized assumptions, derived from standard critiques, like trope analysis. I do not personally think it's within the best interest of adult society to sanitize the complexities of the human experience into something as palatable as a Disney princess movie.
Okay, here we are.
The affirmative or enthusiastic model of consent encourages open, proactive communication, mutual excitement, and respect.
Do you like it?
Like it? I love it! I could kiss you! I could. I mean, I'd like to. May I? Me? I mean, may we? Wait, what?
We may.
A lack of nuance and ambiguity only further conditions us to think within black and white binaries and absolutist frameworks, ostensibly infantilizing us until we can only process characters and narrative details in the broadest and most reductive ways possible.
Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and Rick Deckard have a lot in common. They're always framed as good guys. They're always framed as good guys. They're always framed as good guys.
My dialogue here is an effort to encourage critical thought, rather than insecurely defend problematic text to retain their purity, as some tend to do. Indeed, even the films and artists we enjoy the most should not escape criticism. While an artist is not indebted to the whims of critics, they should at least be conscious of the potential issues that they may be dipping their toes into, or perpetuating, and then make an educated, artistic decision of where to go from there. Sometimes what's best for the text is best for the text, regardless of the tropes it engages with. I would like to wrap up this analysis with a relatively positive examination of the scene, and its arguable subversion of sexist tropes, and further acknowledgement of masculine toxicity. Blade Runner not only adopts, but also subverts tropes commonplace in film noir of the 1920s through 50s. The crowded city of shadows and smoke, with perpetual rainfall, reinforces its neo-noir setting, but the brief moment of clarity reshapes this established order. The archetypes of the reluctant detective hero and his criminal adversary are flipped on their head, as conservative recognitions of moral truths are defenestrated. While the femme fatale character archetype dates far back into literary history, it became a staple within film noir, especially following World War II. Men returned home from battle to witness a paradigm shift in female liberation, as their wives left the traditional confines of their homes by entering the workforce with newfound confidence. Hysteria arose within the men, now feeling emasculated due to losing the extent of power they were previously thought to hold. The proliferation of the femme fatale reflected the shift of cultural attitudes, both by admitting defeat and acknowledging women possess greater power in society and over men than what was previously recognized, and also by painting these strong women as dangerous, seductive, and mysterious threats to men, both on a physical and philosophical level. And for these reasons, the femme fatale can be seen as both feminist and sexist, depending on one's outlook. As history carried on and culture progressed in favor of relative equality between the two traditional genders, the femme fatale trope, as well as the film noir genre, began to fade, occasionally popping back up from time to time, but generally in the context of retro simulacrum. From her business wardrobe to her smoking habits, and from her no-nonsense attitude to her professional cadence and seductive charm, Rachael is coded from head to toe as the femme fatale. This is made abundantly clear by cultural reference during her introduction and the subsequent VK test scene. Just as femme fatales have the power necessary to lie, manipulate, and get away with it, Rachael is able to take the test and leave virtually undetected as a replicant.
She's a replicant, isn't she?
I'm impressed. How many questions does it usually take to spot one?
This reinforces the notion that she is thought to be an existential and physical threat to Deckard, just as the other replicants are, which in turn engages in the socio-political underpinnings of the femme fatale trope. However, when the truth is revealed to Rachael, the audience is encouraged to rethink characters' dispositions. Just as Rachel's identity had been fabricated by man, so too was woman's assigned identity as femme fatale. In truth, these social constructions are not only to be distrusted, but outright rejected in society at large. Rachael does just this, evident by letting her hair down and eventually accepting herself as a confused and vulnerable human being, defined not by what others insist of her, but instead by what she insists of herself. Even if still entrapped by her own social conditioning, her experiences, emotions, and desires are just as valid as anyone else's. By framing Rachael as a victim of the oppressive society, Blade Runner aims to evoke sympathy from its audience. The film exposes the fallacious nature of the femme fatale trope by effectively killing it and legitimizing the female experience. She is no threat to man in the end. If anything, the scene indicates the reverse. Deckard is aggressive and dominant at best, and violent and coercive at worst. Following this moment of questionable consent is a shot of the city skyline. A similar shot with the same Orientalist advertisement follows another pivotal moment. That being when the replicant Leon kills the previous Blade Runner. The similar arrangement of shots invites comparison. Perhaps we could see them as two moments of violence, or at least two violations of the human body, or maybe we can see them as moments of liberation, replicants fighting back against the oppressive order, and for a brief moment, succeeding. Either way, the shot of the skyline can indicate that their experiences, while valid, are ultimately inconsequential in the grand scheme of the dehumanizing order. In short, the seduction scene is contentious by design, with nearly 4 decades of the cast and crew being aware that objection is inevitable. But the scene is meant to evoke questions about human rights and autonomy, questions about existentialism and consent, memories and emotions, identity and love. In all likelihood, we are meant to view Deckard as forcing Rachael to confront what she wants, rather than forcing her to have sex with him.
Was it like you have feelings, but as an android, do you have to be instructed sort of in how to love?
Well, that's the whole point. Basically, what I am is a person who doesn't have any love or sexual experience at all. That makes me...
No comment on any of that. Okay.
That makes me basically having no experience to draw from. So the intention of the scene was that I was running out because I was just reacting like that does not compute, you know. I just don't understand this. I'm getting out of here. For fear. And everybody encounters fear in terms of sexuality and some part of their development as a human being. And I was getting out, and the intention of the scene, the love scene, was for Harrison, for Deckard, to force me to confront my own sexuality as a human being.
But at the same time, we are still encouraged to question the situation in more ways than one. We are encouraged to question everything. Special thanks to my patrons: Pseudomoron, Yakov Rajanoi, George, Greg, Kayla, and Wolfgang.
And also Adam Young and Matt Harrison, who became patrons after this video was recorded.
Thanks for watching. I'm not sure if this video will be controversial or not, but I figured I should at least give my 2 cents. If you agree, disagree, how do you interpret the scene? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to support me, please subscribe, share my work around, and comment below. Anything helps. If you'd like to throw in a couple bucks, I have a Patreon. I have more videos on the way, but like this one, it will be lost in time.